Hey, hi everybody. This one's entitled, How Do I Know If I'm Enmeshed? People often ask me time and time again, what does enmeshment mean? It's not a term they're used to. Most people are used to talking about codependency. That's a common term or word used for enmeshment. Roberta Gilbert, from her book Extraordinary Relationships, a new way of thinking about human interaction. She's a Bowen family systems theory psychiatrist, and she does a lot of teaching of leadership and personal development, personal growth using Bowen family systems. She writes fusion or enmeshment, and again, fusion and enmeshment can be used interchangeably. Emotional attachment of two or more selves, or which the mother-child symbiosis is a paradigm, where we end up in a symbiosis with other people. It can be seen in any intense, important relationship, however. Both selves in a fusion are intensely emotionally reactive to each other and experience a loss or gain of self in the relationship. And often when we are enmeshed with other people, in fact, always when we're enmeshed with other people, we will find ourselves either gaining self, losing self. It's kind of a balancing act that will happen. And much like the Chapman triangle, I can't think what the term is, where you have someone playing the role of victim, then someone playing the role of persecutor, then someone playing the role of rescuer. In other words, we're all just trading these roles back and forth between each other. And much like in an enmeshed relationship, we will trade self or give ourselves over to the relationship rather than maintaining our own sense of self. They will give their self over to the relationship. You'll give yourself over to the relationship. And so that enmeshment occurs when we have that experience. Enmeshment is when two people's emotional functioning overlap. There's too much togetherness. And enmeshment can be characterized either as conflictual fusion or warm fusion. But both are fusion. So you can have a relationship in which, let's say, a couple has just fallen in love with each other and they're going through their honeymoon phase, or maybe the honeymoon phase in the marriage. That's a warm fusion, but it is a fusion. It is an enmeshment. Then what usually happens after they go through the warm fusion, then comes the cold or conflictual fusion. And that's when the arguments start to happen. That's when things get turned on their head. For example, that's when they start to realize the very things they were attracted to that person now are things they don't like. And so we flip in those relationships that are enmeshed. When, let's say, a woman enjoys a man because he spends so much time with her and enjoys that, she enjoys that, he goes along with that, or he may enjoy that. And then they're going through the warm fusion. Then the relationship changes and the woman may decide, I'd like to go out and do things. And now we have a husband who really doesn't want to go out and do things because he's just been used to just this fusion, and that's really what he's wanted. And so I don't need to go out. I don't even want to go out. It's just about us. Well, she's going, I'd like to have more spice in my life. So now the very thing that she was attracted to now becomes something that she feels resentful or irritated about. And then we have the conflictual enmeshment, and then we start arguing about it. The opposite of enmeshment is individuation or differentiation. So you either have fusion, enmeshment, then you can have too much distance or that conflictual enmeshment. But what we want is a balance of togetherness and separateness to bring about intimacy and not enmeshment, because enmeshment causes lots of pinging when we are overlapped with each other emotionally. And we learn this overlapping growing up in our family of origin. And that's often the origin of this enmeshment. Enmeshment causes overfunctioning and underfunctioning. So if you find yourself underfunctioning, you're probably enmeshed with that relationship. If you find yourself overfunctioning, you're probably enmeshed with the relationship. Some people will underfunction in a relationship and become avoidant. And avoidance then is a part of the enmeshment. Because if you weren't enmeshed, there may not be the need for the avoidance. Enmeshment is also known or recognized by our reactivity. The more reactive we are in a relationship, the more we are enmeshed. So if you find yourself in a very reactive relationship, you might want to take a look at enmeshment. That might be a core to one of the problems. Enmeshment is also known by absorbing the feelings, beliefs, criticisms, praise, approval, acceptance, and the emotional states of others. We absorb them into ourselves rather than observing them. We absorb them. Enmeshment also can be characterized as a blurring of personal and psychological boundaries. When those are blurred and we don't know where I end and you begin, then we have enmeshment is probably going to occur. When our emotional and thinking systems are fused, our intellect is emotionally driven. And once our intellect is emotionally driven, then we're going to be fusing and enmeshing with other people. When that limbic system, that older brain, starts controlling in reactivity and controlling the thoughts and thinking that we have, then we've got problems because we're going to then operate out of the emotional system, which is going to get us all enmeshed. In enmeshment, we practice the pseudo-self to maintain the togetherness and separateness. And it's kind of like that original thought I brought up earlier, where we are gaining and losing self within the relationship. We gain some of their self. Now we have a little more self. We lose some of our self, and it goes over to them. And when we have that kind of trade-off negotiated relationship, it's an enmeshed relationship. And again, we do that to maintain the togetherness, to maintain the sameness, to maintain the super self of the relationship. In other words, not two people with selves interacting. It's a super self that we partake of, and we partake of that super self rather than having a self. Roberta Gilbert describes the pseudo-self this way. The part of self that is negotiated in a relationship, it is more reactive, less prone to think before acting, and less guided by principle or self-values or self-awareness or self-knowledge. It is also determined more by the environment, especially relationships, than by the self. When the relationship determines the self, then it's a pseudo-self. When we determine the self, it's true self-differentiation. And you can find that in Roberta Gilbert's book, Extraordinary Relationships. Consciously or unconsciously, checking the barometer in the relationship, scanning to see how we should be. How should I respond? Will they be upset? Should I be worried about this response? When we're doing that, the relationship is too enmeshed. And so we're always consciously or unconsciously checking the barometer in the relationship emotional field. We are enmeshed when we're on the relationship tennis court where there's no tennis net, or they come over to play on our side, or we go over to play on their side. I have a video up about keeping the tennis net in our relationships. So we have some boundaries, so there's respect, valuing, and that I know where I end and where you begin. But when we have this mixing of our emotional lives by having no tennis net, or they're over on our side or we're over on their side, then that's going to look very enmeshed and it's going to feel very enmeshed. When others join us on our side or when there is no tennis net, then often respect goes down. There's often no need to say, I love you, I'm sorry, excuse me, please, showing someone that their opinion matters. It's all assumed. And in an enmeshed relationship, there's a lot of assumptions that are going on. Because again, we're sharing the same super self in this relationship, the relationship super self shell and everything in it. We're just sharing that rather than being ourselves. And so there's less a need, giving parents as an example, they're kind of the parent and they expect us to do certain things and they ask to do certain things, but they don't say thank you. They don't say please because they don't have to, because you're their child. You don't have to say please. You don't have to say thank you. That's assumed. You know I love you, so I don't have to say I love you because that's assumed. Well, that assumption and all those assumptions are a part of that super self. With enmeshment, there are secrets, but no privacy. With healthy relationships and in a healthy system, there's privacy and respect, but not secrets. So you know if you've got secrets but no privacy because someone is intrusive all the time, then you're probably enmeshed. I really like Brené Brown's explanation of enmeshment. She simply states, enmeshment is when we are doing the 4 Ps, or I call them the 4 Ps. Perfecting, pleasing, proving, and pretending. If we're doing any of those, then we're probably enmeshed. And she makes a good description of that in her books. I would recommend Brené Brown. Some people ask, well, what's the difference between codependency and enmeshment? Are they the same thing? Well, in many ways, they are the same thing, but they are looking at the same phenomena, only with a different perspective. Codependency is a family systems type of term, but it comes from the chemical dependency world and addictions world. And again, the co-dependent on the dependent, who is the alcoholic or addict, and then you have co-dependent because they end up being dependent on them, whereas they're dependent on the alcohol or drugs. Enmeshment is a term used by family systems theorists, but they can be used interchangeably. There's a lot of similar and overlapping dynamics for codependency and enmeshment. I tend to like enmeshment better because it takes in a larger part of the system, and I can talk about that later. Common enmeshment examples when you might be enmeshed: parents who are constantly worried about their children. So worry and concern is an enmeshment state. It's an obsessive enmeshment state. And when someone's worried, my hunch is enmeshment is present. And so we need greater detachment. Another example, a child feels guilty, maybe even an adult child feels guilty so often around their parents, communicating with their parents. If we're always feeling guilty, we're always feeling ashamed, then our shame and guilt is being pinged so much, and we are probably enmeshed. The family gathering syndrome. When we become a child while we're an adult, when we go back and visit family of origin, all of a sudden we find ourselves operating much differently than we did 2 months ago. When we're home with the family of origin, we find ourselves slipping into those roles, acting more strangely, not like an adult, more like a child. It's going back to those holiday gatherings and we're not ourselves. We become a part of that old family again. That's enmeshment as well. When we can't say no without guilt. Reactive marriages are definitely enmeshment type of relationships. Engulfed relationships. That's where 2 weeks in, we've fallen in love. Now we're both engulfed in each other. And we communicate to each other like we're clones of each other. And remember, they're just such a soulmate. We can talk so well. Well, that's because you're going through the cloning phase. You're talking to yourself and they're talking to you. You're also sharing a super self, and you also are gaining and losing self in the relationship. So it feels so right and so together. But actually it's kind of that warm enmeshment or warm infusion that's happening. Over seriousness in relationships is often a sign of enmeshment. Rescuing, caretaking, over sympathizing in terms of friendships or relationships, that's often a sign of enmeshment. And highly anxious relationships, where there's a lot of anxiety, that is also a sign of enmeshment. Why do I want to describe enmeshment? Because what we also want to work on is learning to detach, and that detachment is needed. Differentiate is needed when we have these enmeshment relationships. And that's why we work on detachment. And that's why we work on becoming more neutral in relationships. I don't mean less loving. I don't mean less caring. I mean less enmeshment, because enmeshment is not love. Warm fusion is not love. Conflictual fusion is not love. Love is two selves, separate while connected. That is where intimate love originates. I want to thank you for watching today. I'll be sharing more about detachment and differentiation and how we can utilize that more in our own lives. Thanks for watching.